Company car parking is abolished. Tax relief on home improvement loans will disappear from this April, and relief on expenditure on commercial woodland is abolished, so plugging a favourite tax avoidance loophole of the very rich.
Threshold at which companies must register for VAT has been raised to £22,100. Mr Lawson said this is as much as EEC regulations allow him to do. On company taxation, no change on the standard rate of corporation tax, which remains at 35%, but the small business rate has come down in line with income tax to 25%. And on capital gains tax, the Chancellor has simplified the system and brought its rates into line with the two new rates of income tax. He's also made capital gains made before 1982 exempt from tax. That means that only real gains, rather than those as a result of the hyperinflation of the 1970s, will be taken into account. Because he's made this concession, he's reduced the threshold above which the tax is paid from £6,600 a year to £5,000.
Finally, the business expansion scheme has been extended to companies specialising in the letting of residential property. They'll get full tax relief. He hopes it'll lead to growth in the private rented housing market.
No budget speech in memory has had such a rough reception from the opposition. First, Mr Lawson's announcement of the twopence off income tax was interrupted by Mr Alex Salmond of the Scots Nationalists, and with the vote to suspend Mr Salmond from the Commons. Then his passage about one single higher rate tax band of 40% was drowned out by the chants of shame, shame from Labour. Chancellor said his radical tax reforming budget removed manifest injustices from the taxpayer. Opposition MPs accuse him of cheating injustice and of putting greed before need.
As Nigel Lawson posed for the traditional peaceful pre-budget pictures, he might have anticipated meeting critics in the Commons, but not the extraordinary scenes which awaited him. It was his income tax proposals which caused the problem. First, that cut in basic rate. The Scottish Nationalist MP Alex Salmond started making his own speech, despite efforts by fellow MPs to make him sit down.
I name Mr Alex Salmond.
And after the Deputy Speaker named him, Mr Lawson had to wait so that MPs could vote to expel Mr Salmond by 354 votes to 19. The MP said afterwards he was protesting about the poll tax. Worse was to follow when the Chancellor announced reductions in the top rate of tax from 60 to 40%. There were roars of protest on the Labour benches, led by Alan Meale and Bernie Grant. But the cries of shame grew in volume, and eventually the Deputy Speaker, Harold Walker, suspended the sitting for 10 minutes. The Labour leader also disapproved.
Don't get mad, get even, and I assert again that in this House and everywhere else in this democracy, argument is always superior to the form of action we have seen in the course of this afternoon.
But the man who started the chant was unrepentant.
The noise had to be made, because what he was doing in there today was slapping the poor in the face. We had to be heard. It was the only thing we could do, and we did it. All right, we chanted, we made noises, but we told him exactly what we thought. It had to be stopped. What he did today hasn't been done this century by any Chancellor.
These extraordinary scenes have had two immediate consequences. They've embarrassed the Labour leadership, which wanted to concentrate on the budget, and they've also given fresh ammunition to those who oppose the televising of Parliament. Peter Allen, News at 10, Westminster.
As the Chancellor left for the Commons, the smiles and kisses for the photographers certainly reflected an inner satisfaction that, as he put it later, he'd done the double. Major tax reform to be announced in a budget which once again returned to the principle of balancing the books. 3 hours later, what Mr Lawson called the absolute disgrace of the appalling scenes in the Commons had left him in no doubt of the political row ahead. A fight between an opposition outraged, they say, by a budget which ignores both the poor and the health service, and a government which sees the rewards of a properly managed economy running on wealth generation, not borrowed cash. The argument reflected in these Commons exchanges.
It looks as if the final outturn for 1987-88 will be a budget surplus of £3 billion. Instead of a PSBR, a PSDR. Not a public sector borrowing requirement, but a public sector debt repayment.
He offered nothing at all to the National Health Service. And by comparison, with his handout to the richest in Britain, offered a puny, marginal, negligible amount to those who constitute the average people of our society.
Now, Mr. Kinnock's point there was taken up later by Shadow Chancellor John Smith, who added in his anger at the Chancellor having kept the cap on national insurance contributions.